Mrs. Johnston, it is time for knowledge and social studies. We are on Unit 12, Presidents and American Symbols, and today's story is called A Dishonest Story About an Honest Man. Let's discuss what we learned in our last read aloud, the one that you heard about the capital city of Washington, D.C. Who is Washington, D.C. named for? Did you remember and say George Washington? What what is a president? A president is the elected or chosen leader of a country. A president has a lot of responsibilities because he or she helps to lead the country. You also heard about different monuments in Washington, D.C. that were created to honor past presidents. There are other ways to remember and honor people. For example, you can tell stories about the great things that they did. Today's read aloud tells about the actions of our first president, George Washington. So let's think about the first president and that this person had special characteristics or qualities that most good presidents have. So, what does it take to be a good president? Did you respond and say some of these things? Fair, honest, trustworthy, accountable? What kind of person do you need to be in order to lead a whole country? Someone who thinks of the people versus himself or herself? Somebody that abides by rules and makes things fair? One important characteristic of a good president is honesty, which you will hear about in today's read aloud. Listen carefully to hear about George Washington's honesty. Can you name the person that you see in this picture? Did you say George Washington? Almost everyone likes a good story. Some people especially like true stories that tell how real people did real things. Other people say, I love made up stories best. A person who tells this kind of story can decide to leave in only the most interesting parts and even make sure that there will be a happy ending. However, there is a third kind of story that mixes together true and made up stories. Today's story is an example of this third type of story and is what we call a legend. It is called A Dishonest Story About an Honest Man. Honest means truthful or trustworthy. This is going to be a story that's not really true about a man who was really truthful. This story is about George Washington, a real person who acts in the story in an honest way, as he often acted in real life. The true part of this story is that George Washington was a real person, and he was very honest. The made up part is that he cut down his father's cherry tree. This is young George Washington with his father, Augustine Washington. Augustine Washington loved his farm by the river. He loved the rolling green meadows in which he raised horses and other animals. He loved the woods. He loved the rich soil that allowed him to grow plants for food on the farm or to sell in town. He loved the fruit trees on his farm that gave him beautiful flowers in the spring, delicious fruit through the summer and autumn, and graceful shapes to look at in the winter. Augustine especially loved his cherry trees. When his son George was about 5 years old, Augustine said, "George, I will teach you which sorts of cherry trees grow best here, and how to take care of them, so they will grow tall and strong and go give us delicious fruit." Were Augustine's cherry trees important to him? Yes. How can you tell? He knew how to take care of them, how to make them grow tall and strong, and which ones gave the most delicious fruit. So you can imagine how upset Augustine was to find one day that someone had chopped down one of his prized trees. This particular day, he was walking with his foreman, a man who worked for him and helped him run his farm. Augustine said, "This was no accident. Someone did it on purpose. Look how neat a job of cutting this was. No wild animal could have done that. Who would do such a thing?" His foreman replied, "I just can't imagine who would have the nerve to do it, sir, or the reason." Who do you think cut down the cherry tree? Did you say George? Or maybe you don't know. Caught up in their conversation, the two men did not notice little George Washington approaching from the house. The boys silently listened to the two grown-ups. Where is George hiding in the picture? Did you say behind the tree? He looked at his father's face and saw disappointment and anger. George stepped forward, looking pale and worried, to the shock of his father and the foreman. George said quietly but firmly, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the tree with my little axe. I wanted to see if I could do it, but now I know it was a bad thing to do." Augustine Washington looked at his son. He could see from the expression on his face, or the look on his face, how badly George felt. Meanwhile, the foreman, surprised by the boy's confession, turned back to look at Augustine Washington. George Washington's confession was when he admitted that he was the one who cut down the tree. He thought, Mr. Washington sometimes has a bad temper. Poor George. I hate to think what is about to happen to him. But to his surprise, he heard the father tell his son, "It was a bad thing to do, George, and you should be punished for doing it. However, I so respect you, or admire or think well of you, for coming forward and telling me the truth, that if you will promise not to do such a thing again, I shall not punish you." "I promise, father," said George, and he kept that promise. So you see, even as a young boy, George Washington was honest and took responsibility for his actions. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us could be like that? That is the famous legend of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's important to remember that his story about George Washington and the cherry tree is a legend because it is partly true and partly made up. What part of the story was true? The part that George Washington was honest. What part of the story was made up? The part where he cut down the cherry tree. You might ask, was George Washington really an honest man? Actually, he was. After he grew up and became President of the United States, one of the things for which he was most famous was his honesty. What is even more interesting is the way in which people looked up to the real George Washington. Looked up to is another way of saying respected. Washington was not perfect. He made mistakes, as everyone does at times. A few times he made decisions with which his friends disagreed. When that happened, they usually said, "We wouldn't have chosen differently, but we know he made this choice for a good reason and not to just help himself." Even the King of Great Britain, King George III, admired Washington. Washington fought against the King of Great Britain's armies for many years and won. That's how the colonies, started by the Pilgrims and others, became the United States, a country free from the rule of the King of Great Britain. After King George lost control of the colonies to the people there, who now thought of themselves as Americans, he expected Washington to make himself king of the new nation. Instead, Washington decided to give up control of the army he led and go home to Mount Vernon, his farm in Northern Virginia. When King George heard George Washington's plan, he said, "If he can do that, he is the greatest man in the world." Do you think King George respected George Washington? Yes. Why do you feel that way? No. Why did you choose that way? George Washington is often described as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. There are many reasons for that, George Washington was the most important leader in winning the war that freed the American colonies from the control of Great Britain and the King. The American colonies no longer had to follow the King of Great Britain's law. They now had the liberty or freedom to make their own laws. Washington was one of the most important people involved in setting up the new government, in starting the new country in the right direction. He was also the most admired and trusted person in that new country. Today, we still look up to George Washington. In fact, he is considered one of the greatest national heroes. National means having to do with a nation. His face is on the front of the $1 bill and on front of the quarter. All across America, there are cities, towns, and streets named after him. From Washington, D.C. to the state of Washington. More than 200 years after he died, some people still ask, what would Washington do when making important decisions? George Washington never chopped down that cherry tree, but he left us something that blossoms brightly in all seasons, the example of a brave and honest man. What kind of story is the story of George Washington and the cherry tree? Did you remember it was called a legend? Why is the story of George Washington and the cherry tree considered a legend? The story is considered a legend because parts of it are true and parts of it are not true. It is true that George Washington was an honest person, but it is not true that he chopped down a cherry tree. Is a legend completely true story, a completely made up story, or a mix of both? A legend is a story that mixes together truth and made up events. In this legend, who cut down the cherry tree? Augustine's son, George Washington, cut down the cherry tree. Why is George Washington remembered today? Why is he considered one of our greatest national heroes? George Washington is remembered today because he was an honest man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Washington was the most important leader in winning the war that freed America from the control of Great Britain. And Washington was one of the most important people involved in setting up the new government in starting the new country in the right direction. I hoped you enjoyed our story today, a dishonest story about an honest man.